Okay. Well, you're very welcome to the Bardic tradition, the story of the story. And what we covered last week was a number of things. One of them was the idea that each culture has its compendium of stories that are shared by everyone, and they are the culture's mythographics. And what they are typically a mixture of stories that people have heard early in their life before they can read and write, the stories they learn to read and write, and various other stories from history and religion. And they are hugely important, and that's really what we're focusing on. We also introduced the idea of mythic history, which I'm going to come back to in a little while. But the essential idea there is that the past is best understood or could be understood through the big emotions that shape culture, and they rather than the facts of history or history as written by the leaders. And so what we're adopting is a whiz through Irish history, but very much from the perspective of the big culturally shared history. And then we moved on last week to the idea, or sorry, not the idea, the foundation story of the Irish. And it was pointed out that there was a native tradition. It's the one that we've been looking at very much, which is the Book of Invasions, with the story of Cessa, Partholon, Nemed, the Firbolg, and the Tuatha Danann. And this is the pre-Celtic peoples who typically had fled from some part of Europe, from oppression, from floods, and from various other things. And so in a way that puts Ireland very much in the context of the not chosen people of the world. Because later on, as we move on, we're going to hear about the chosen people of the world. The Irish are very much the not chosen. And so any system of government or organization or culture would be deeply informed by, we are not going to be oppressive or tyrants. And I think that's very evident in a lot of the philosophy, the culture, the worldview of the Irish. We also established that the Irish are the people from somewhere else, which I think is very interesting in modernity, because Ireland does not have its own native creation myth. So that was the background. But then when we looked at the foundation story of the Irish, we also looked at Leabhar go Bhalla, and I would have pointed out last week that the native tradition was in the 7th century cut off at the stem, and inserted in there was a very different mythology, and that was the mythology of Genesis and the Old Testament. And it literally was take a tree, cut it, and then insert on the base these universal roots that go right back to Genesis, Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, and the dispersal of the nations, because God didn't like that everyone spoke the same language. And then I would have finished off last week pointing out, and I sent you out a table of all the foundational and fundamental differences between what's essentially a patriarchal mythology and a matriarchal mythology. So do look at write-up number 3, which has this table. I have it here redone, and it's just quite stunning in the contrast. What would have happened in the 11th century is a poet pulled together this tradition to form Leabhar go Bhalla. Now, one of the things we have to ask is, okay, the monks wrote in this universal tradition, but did it actually have much impact on the Irish? Because it seems that the ancient Irish approach to Christianity was very much their own. It was little influenced by the Roman culture, which was spreading throughout Europe and getting rid of the indigenous traditions, but then that carried on in the Catholic Church. So the Romans may never have got to Ireland, but the church made an attempt. But the impression is that it didn't have much of an influence, and the nature-loving orientation seems to very much permeate Celtic Christianity. But anyway, that was the background, this enormous contrast between a very strong native tradition and this super implanted, cut the stem off and introduce another mythology. And one of the questions that we have is, what influence did that have, particularly during the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th century? But before we get going today, I'd like to talk about something else, which is in the domain of mythic history. I just want to build in it and partly suggest an orientation that we might have for the rest of this program. And what I want to talk about now, I'll send out a briefing note in the next couple of days. It's to do with mythic history and an idea from Giambattista Vico called Fantasia. Now, for any of you that know much about the origins of history, you would probably know the founding fathers of history come from the Greek world of 5th century Athens, and they are Thucydides and Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a book called Histories, and Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And both were iconic in their field, and both were very clear about the importance of getting original sources and a kind of factual approach and strict standards of research. In a way, it was establishing an argument for a rational approach to history. And Thucydides, for example, was extremely clear that he did not want to cover anything about the intervention of the deities, the Greek gods and goddesses. So what moving forward, many millennia, in fact, 2 millennia, this whole rational approach to the world in a way was picked up by the Enlightenment, and one in the 17th and 18th centuries. And one of the hopes here was that the rational approaches that were getting great results in mathematics and the natural sciences could be applied not only to history, but as a way of addressing moral, social, political, and indeed economic problems of mankind. So there was the primacy really of the rational and the mind was very much in the ascendancy, and you could understand why, because of the huge advances in many fields, and particularly the natural sciences. But there was another quieter voice that was not about the rational. Sorry, but there's one thing I do want to say is part of this agenda was an attempt to demythologize. They did use the word myth, but what they were trying to do is deal with a mankind bedeviled by ignorance and error, superstition and prejudice, much of it deliberately spread by priests, princes, the ruling classes, and the bureaucrats who disseminated falsehoods as a means of keeping men obedient to their will, which makes it clear that fake news and propaganda was very much the concern. It's not a new issue. It's been around throughout history. But what we've got essentially is a rational approach. And in a way, what it was seeking to do is get rid of the superstitions, myth meaning nonsense. But there was an alternative approach. And the person that I'm particularly interested in is an 18th century Italian thinker called Giambattista Vico, who said that the first science to be learned is mythology and the interpretation of fables. Now, he was largely ignored, but in his book, The New Science, he basically said that if we want to understand the ancients, we need to respect their myths and metaphors, their rituals and their symbols. He was a philologist and a philosopher. And he said something else, which I think is very interesting from our perspective. And what it was instead of a factual approach to history, it was an approach to history that recognized the role of the imagination. And he called this Fantasia. And what he was particularly interested in was understanding the past, not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of whole societies. And in order to do that, his argument was that we need to use our imagination and imagine what life was like back then with all the information that we can piece together. And I think that is an exciting task. Can you do it in a way that is rigorous in terms of its sources? No, but what you are doing is bringing the imagination in. And so what I'd like us to do with this project in the story of the story is use a bit of Fantasia. And as we go through the program, what we're going to do is ask you in small groups to be imaginative and imagine what it was like to be a working class Catholic at the time of Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries, or someone who's in Gronja Whale in the west of Mayo, dealing with the emergence of the Tudors and the chosen people. So I think there's an awful lot we can do using Fantasia, using the imagination. So what I'd like to do now is let's break into our small groups, spend a little bit of time recapping on what we did last week and what's particularly struck you and what you found yourself thinking about last week, and then maybe talking a little bit about this idea of Fantasia. So we'll do that for 10 minutes, and then we'll get into the area of the Bardic schools and in the Bardic schools and the introduction of Christianity and St. Patrick. Okay.